What does it mean now that churches, houses of worship, and clergy can endorse political candidates without risking their tax-exempt status? My name is Benjamin Park. I'm a scholar of American history and religion, and in this video I'd like to provide some context to the recent political news. Last week, the IRS, following directions from the Trump administration, in a tax filing made clear that they would no longer be seeking to challenge the tax-exempt status of churches and clergy and houses of worship on the basis of them endorsing political candidates, overturning a 70-year-old legislative precedent known as the Johnson Amendment. In many ways, this was the fulfillment of a promise that Donald Trump made years ago. Here's a video of him speaking just weeks into his first presidential term in 2017 regarding the Johnson Amendment.
That is why I will get rid of and totally destroy the Johnson Amendment and allow our representatives of faith to speak freely and without fear of retribution. I will do that, remember.
So as you can see, this move was a fulfillment of one of the promises Donald Trump has long made. It's also the culmination of a decades-long move on the religious right to overturn this provision. So in this video, I want to talk about the longer history of what led to the Johnson Amendment and what led to its collapse, and how that might change America's religious environment. Let's dig in. But first, we need a little bit of context, and we need to talk at least briefly about the 19th century and the founding of America through eventually when the Johnson Amendment was implemented. Throughout the 19th century, there was a general understanding, though not always consistent, and the degree to which it was enforced varied, there was a general understanding that clergy should not be involved in political matters. That did not mean that religion and politics operated in separate spheres. They definitely did not. There was a Protestant quasi-majority that controlled American politics. But in the idea of a separation between church and state, the phrase that came from Thomas Jefferson and soon became quite commonplace in America, that separation of church and state did not mean the separation of church and politics or religion and politics, but it meant a separation between clergy and elected offices. There was deep suspicion in religious leaders infringing on what was called the personal conscience of the voters, that everyday citizens should be able to vote on their own whim and not be told how to vote by their religious leaders. Now, religious leaders could and did structure the world and the morals and the ideals and the principles and the priorities, but they should not specifically say how to vote. And that, in fact, action is what got a lot of marginalized voices in trouble. The two most prominent examples would be the Mormons, who often voted according to what Joseph Smith and then Brigham Young would tell them, or the Catholics, who often blocked their votes together in cities like New York City and Philadelphia in order to make sure that electoral officials listened to their interests. Now, the Protestant majority in America felt very uncomfortable with that, saying that that was a betrayal of democratic principles, that those clergy should not act as political operatives. And those marginalized religious groups were further punished. Joseph Smith was killed. The Mormons were forced from one community to another. The Catholics were often the targets of anti-Catholic violence and riots and mobocracy. Meanwhile, and I should emphasize, one reason why mainstream Protestant groups did not have religious clergy dictating the political whims of their followers is they did not need to. There was a general cultural belief that structured how people operated. And so the distance between religious denominations and these political parties were not always as clear. But again, there was a general sentiment that ministers should not specifically get involved in electoral matters. By the way, if you enjoyed this type of historical analysis, please make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Every Monday, I do deep dives on historical topics. Wednesdays, I connect the past to the present. And Fridays, I peel back the layers to talk about the historical work behind some of the most important interventions so that you too can become a historical expert. Let's get back to the history. This unstated and not always consistent, but entrenched practice in America of distrusting clergy to get involved in political electoral processes was enshrined during the 1950s. This is an era of Christian nationalism, the rising idea of America becoming a Christian nation, especially in response to the Cold War and that atheistic communistic Russia. This is during the time when one nation under God becomes enshrined as the political motto for the nation. It's also the time when in God we trust is added permanently to the national currency, and under God is added to the national Pledge of Allegiance. All of these things seem to sacralize this idea of America being a Christian nation, which is why it's important to note that it's during that same time in 1954, the legislature passes what comes to be known as the Johnson Amendment, named after Lyndon Johnson, a powerful Texas senator who would later become JFK's vice president and then president after JFK's death. How do we square those two things? That on the one hand, the legislature is making it clear in their minds that this is a Christian nation, and on the other, they're trying to decrease the power of clergy in the public sphere. Those things should not be seen in competition. Rather, they should be seen as balancing each other. Politicians wanted to recognize the role of religion in society, but they did not want that to lead to individual congregations and pastors and clergy to interfere again with the personal consciousness. You can see this as a compromise that, yes, we will acknowledge religion's role in society, but with qualifications, guardrails, and these safeguards to make sure that religious leaders stay in their proper sphere. But that balance comes under assault during the 1970s and 1980s with the rise of the religious right, the time that evangelicals who had long been on the sidelines, who had denounced the political sphere as too corrupt, start re-entering that political arena, and by the end of the 1970s, solely on the side of Republican parties. Now, there is a bit of a flirtation with Jimmy Carter, who was the first evangelical president, but soon most evangelical leaders like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, Billy Graham decided that Jimmy Carter and the Democrats did not match their values, and at the same time, the Republican Party, trying to reassert its control after losing after trying to regain power in the South as part of the Southern strategy, form a coalition that comes to be known as the religious right. And the person who personified that merging was Ronald Reagan, the previous Hollywood actor, California governor, who then runs for the presidency on the Republican platform in 1980. Watch this video of Ronald Reagan speaking to religious leaders and recognizing this dynamic that you can't endorse me because of the tax-exempt status and the laws on the books, but I want you to know that I am on your side.
A few days ago, I addressed a group in Chicago and received their endorsement for my candidacy. Now, I know this is a nonpartisan gathering, and so I know that you can't endorse me, but I only brought that up because I want you to know that I endorse you and what you are doing.
What you just saw was actually one of the major turning points in American religious history, the fusion of the religious right and Republican politicians. Ronald Reagan, who would not have been seen as the front, as the face for evangelical America, endorses their values, and they in turn endorse him for the presidency. That forms this merging of the Republican Party and right-wing evangelicals, which is codified 12 years later at the 1992 Republican National Convention, when Pat Robertson, who had led a challenge against George H.W. Bush, told evangelicals that this party is your home. Don't go anywhere else. This is where we are going to work together. So in many ways, when Trump gets in front of religious leaders a few decades later in 2017 and promises that I am going to destroy the Johnson Amendment, that was fulfilling the type of pledge that had started way back with Ronald Reagan and the religious right. Ronald Reagan endorsed the evangelicals so that decades later, the evangelicals could endorse Donald Trump. Now, I want to emphasize that ignoring the restrictions of the Johnson Amendment has not solely been a Republican thing. Black churches, Black communities, dating all the way back to Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, have also gotten involved in electoral politics, merging those spheres together. They would frequently emphasize the difference, of course, that they are not getting in to support a particular political party, but principles, the definition of moral issues of getting involved, although that often did mean endorsing specific candidates and platforms. So is the functional repeal of the Johnson Amendment, which is probably going to have some legal ramifications since it's still a law on the books, is the functional repeal through the IRS going to change things in America? Well, I'm going to give the maddeningly complicated historian answer of no and yes. No, I don't think it's going to change much because the Johnson Amendment hasn't really been enforced in decades. There have only been a small handful of instances of churches being punished or having their tax-exempt status threatened through their political involvement. So on the one hand, this is more of a recognition of where American society has been for a few decades. On the other hand, there is potential for change, because while I don't think this is going to change the political scene much, it could change individual churches that court political support or wily politicians who try to funnel money and support through these churches as quasi-super PACs and then transform those congregations to extensions of political platforms. And I think it's important to note that the idea of clergy and churches endorsing political candidates is vastly unpopular in the United States. One poll from about a decade ago showed that 79% of Americans disagreed with the idea of churches and clergy endorsing political candidates. And that number had been growing. So I don't have more recent figures, but I think it's safe to say that this might be an unpopular measure for those churches that tend to embrace it, which means that churches might become even more polarized and partisan in today's sphere, which is frankly a bit hard to understand. So in other words, I'm not sure that no longer enforcing the Johnson Amendment is going to change national politics, but I do think it's very possible that it's going to change churches. I hope this video made sense. I hope this broader context helps you understand what this new move does and does not mean. If you found this video helpful, please like and share it with others and subscribe to this channel. History has never been more relevant because there is every day these instances of actions and beliefs and activities and policies that only make sense when placed within the longer context. So I hope you stick around so that we can have more of these discussions.